What is going on, chess YouTube? So in today's video, I want to show you one of the craziest games ever played between Gukesh, the new world champion, and Magnus Carlsen, the greatest chess player of all time. And this game did take place in the 2023 Fide World Cup. And here we go. In the game, Gukesh is playing as white. He opens 1d4, and here Magnus goes 1, knight f6, the Indian defense. Now we have bishop f4, the London system. Gukesh does play quite a bit of the London, especially in rapid and blitz games, but here we have a classical game where he's busting it out. Very interesting. All right, here Magnus. b6 is the move. Not the standard move for black. Typically, black does go d5, followed by c5 at the highest level, but b6 is also very, very playable. Obviously, black is intending bishop b7, and then from there, depending on what white does, black's going to have a variety of different setups to choose from. Now here, the main moves for white are e3 and knight f3. Those are the very typical London system moves for white. But instead here, Gukesh, he does go knight to c3, transposing back to some sort of Jobava London system. Now the Jobava London typically goes d4, then knight to c3, and then bishop f4. The idea being you want to go for a very fast queen d2, long castles, and start an attack against the black king on the king side. And here, this is going to lead to a crazy game. All right, here Magnus does continue. Bishop b7, fianchettoing that light squared bishop. And now here Gukesh, he plays the stronger move, and this one is very double-edged. That is the move f3, intending e4, getting the very strong pawn center. But of course, the drawback of this move f3, it does block in that knight on g1. It no longer has access to the f3 square, and this is a very committal, very double-edged move by white. All right, now here Magnus. The strongest move, obviously, is the very thematic idea of d5, clamping down in the center, and then it will be a lot harder for white to go e4. I mean, technically, e4 is still playable, but black's going to get a lot of counterplay in the center if that is what white goes for. So overall, d5 is the key move here for black. Now, instead, in this position, Magnus, he does go e6, a very typical idea in a lot of Indian defenses against 1d4. The idea being now, of course, that dark square bishop has access to the b4 square, putting pressure on that knight on c3 and pinning it to the king on e1 if it does go bishop b4. But the drawback of this move, white can simply go e4 immediately, as Gukesh does in the game, getting that strong pawn center on d4 and e4 immediately. And obviously here, white is certainly fighting for the opening advantage. All right, now here, according to the engine, the best continuation for Magnus as black is to play safe and solid, just going bishop b7 and short castles. But that is a very difficult series of moves to make. Obviously, white's going to go queen d2 and long castles, and white is kind of getting everything he wants out of the opening, and it's almost like some sort of Pirc defense situation where, again, white's going to have a massive attack on the king side. Now, instead of that here, Magnus did go a6, taking control of the b5 square. That is important in some lines. White obviously is threatening the idea of knight b5, targeting that weak pawn on c7 with the knight and the bishop. That is one of the key ideas of the Jobava London system. But beyond that, of course, black may also be threatening to move b5, threatening b4 later in the game, trying to get some counterplay going on the queen side. Now here, Gukesh, he has several different ways to proceed here. In the game, he did just go queen d2, intending long castles, but real fast, I want to point out, the computer loves the idea of going e5 immediately. The point being, after e5, knight d5, then knight takes, bishop takes, then white's going to have a raging attack on the king side. For example, he can go queen d2, bishop g5, and so on. Again, getting a massive attack. All right, here, queen d2 was played in the game, and now Magnus finally breaks in the center with the move d5. Finally gaining some space, and now, of course, Magnus is threatening the sequence. D takes e4, then f takes, then either bishop takes or knight takes, winning that pawn on e4. So, Gukesh now, he's going to have to respond to that threat somehow, some way. The main ways you can respond are, for example, e5, getting rid of the attack on the pawn, or defending with, say, bishop d3, or just trading on d5 with e takes d5. So all these moves are playable, but instead, in the game, Gukesh, he goes for what looks to be some sort of temporary pawn sacrifice, and he does play the move long castles. Now, of course, black is going to have the option of trading on e4, but that would open up the game when white has castled and black's king is still stuck on e8. Therefore, instead of that here, Magnus, he does go bishop b4, putting immediate pressure on that knight on c3 to the queen on d2. And now d takes e4 is a much bigger threat, as of course, again, that knight is pinned on c3 to the queen. Now, the computer found other ideas. For example, b5 was quite strong, but instead, bishop b4 played in the game. Now here, Gukesh, how does he want to respond? Well, the best way to continue is e5, driving back that knight and getting rid of the attack on the pawn. For example, e5, knight f d7, then bishop g5, targeting the queen on d8 is very strong. Instead here, Gukesh, he plays the second strongest move in the position. That is the move a3, putting the question to the bishop immediately. Now, this move may look like it is losing that pawn on e4, and technically it is. However, Gukesh, he has a lot of ideas here. Now, in the game, Magnus, of course, he did trade on c3. If you retreat back to, say, e7, and it's like, why did you go bishop b4 in the first place, giving white that free tempo a3? Therefore, bishop takes b4 is really the only good move here. Now, Gukesh does go queen takes c3, and now, very importantly, Gukesh, he has a lot of pressure on that pawn on c7. If black takes on e4, he will have the option of just going, say, bishop takes c7, then maybe bishop takes b6, and so on, and he will be doing just fine. Now here, Magnus, he does trade on e4, d takes e4, and now Gukesh, the strongest move, as discussed, is just bishop takes c7, intending bishop takes b6. But instead here, Gukesh, he plays a madman's move. He actually goes for the move d5. Now, what the heck is the point of this move? This move is wild. He's really just giving up a pawn to try and open up lines against the black king, and there are a lot of tactical ideas here. For example, if black takes on d5 with the bishop, bishop takes d5, then bishop takes c7 is extremely strong. Just trust me on that. Instead, if black goes, say, e takes d5, that's also be due to, again, bishop takes c7. And finally, in the game, black did go knight takes d5. But here, of course, instead of bishop takes c7, that move is no bueno, as obviously the knight does control c7, and it's hitting the queen on c3. Instead here, this move opens up the attack of the queen on the pawn on g7, and here Gukesh just flies in with the queen, wins that pawn on g7, and of course now there is no time to win that bishop on f4, as if you take the bishop, then queen takes h8 will be the response by white. You win the rook, and of course, you basically win the game on the spot. So with that in mind here, Magnus, he plays maybe the only good move as black, that is queen to f6 with the x-ray a defense of the rook on h8, as well as pressuring the queen and the bishop on f4. Now here, queen takes f6 is virtually forced. There is nothing else. So queen takes f6 played in the game. Now Magnus does win back the queen. Knight takes f6. And now here, Gukesh, instead of trading on, winning the pawn on c7 immediately, he does go bishop e5, a very cheeky move, tried to pin that knight on f6 to the rook on h8. Now here, of course, Magnus, he does defend the knight. King to e7 is the move. Of course, you can't move the knight, say knight d5, as then the rook on h8 would hang. So, king e7 played in the game, and now Gukesh does trade on c7. Bishop takes c7, winning that free pawn. Now we have knight bd7, and now here, Gukesh, he simply slides back his bishop, getting it out of the attack. Bishop g3, and now, for the most part, the dust has settled. Both sides do have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns, 6 pawns apiece. Of course, the pawns on e4 and f3 will be traded sooner or later. Then both sides will have 5 pawns. And the main imbalance here is the fact that white does have that bishop pair, those 2 b's on g3 and f1. However, overall, the computer does seem to think black has better central control, and that does give him a small advantage in this position. All right, now here, Magnus, rook h g8, activating his rook on the semi-open g file. Now bishop e2, king to e8, and now we have f takes e4 and knight takes e4. Now here, in this position, black has quite a bit of pressure on the bishop on g3. What is Gukesh going to do? Is he going to try to save it? Well, turns out no, he is not. He just goes bishop f3, sort of artificially fianchettoing his light-squared bishop, putting a lot of pressure on this long diagonal. Now here, Magnus, he decides it is time to trade on g3, knight takes g3, and here we have a very interesting tactical opportunity. Here, Gukesh can play the move bishop takes b7, at which point both the rook on a8 and the rook on h1 would be hanging to those minor pieces. That would be a very interesting continuation, but instead in the game, he plays the much simpler move. That is just h takes g3. Now we have bishop takes, knight takes, and rook takes g3. Black seemingly is winning a pawn, but of course that pawn on h7 is now hanging to the rook, and white takes it. Rook takes h7. Now here, of course, white is threatening rook h8, for skewering both the king on e8 and the rook on a8. That would be no good. So with that in mind here, black does go king to e7, getting his king off the back rank. Now we have knight d4, activating the knight, potentially threatening ideas like, for example, knight c6 hitting the king. Therefore here, knight to e5 does defend that c6 square from the knight. All right, now rook to e1, pressures the knight. Where's Magnus going to go? In the game, he does go rook g4, opting not to defend, but instead counterattacking that white knight on d4 instead. Now we have rook takes e5, rook takes d4, And now suddenly, we do have a 2 rook and pawn endgame. Both sides have those 2 rooks and 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns apiece. Of course, Magnus is the greatest endgame player of all time. He's certainly going to be favored in this endgame, but Gukesh, you can't count out the current world champion from any game. All right, now, rook to e2 is the move, then rook a d8, Magnus getting both of his rooks into the game. Now, of course, the threat is rook d1. That would be checkmate on the spot, the audacity of Magnus. Of course, Gukesh spots this. He just goes c3, knocking back that rook. Now we have rook to f4, sliding over the rook. And here, very importantly, the computer seems to think Gukesh should be going rook g7, defending that g2 pawn in advance and taking control of the open g-file. Instead, king to c2 is the move, and now Magnus swings over with his own rook g8, capitalizing on the semi-open g-file, pressuring g2, and starting to seize control of this endgame. All right, now here, the computer seems to think moves like rook h2 and king d2 are the way forward for white. Instead, Gukesh does go b4, gaining space on the queen side, but this is quite a bit weaker in this position. Now here, Magnus, b5 is the move, trying to clamp down on the queen side. Very interesting. Now we have king b3, potentially setting up ideas like a4 and c4. One of those, potentially trying to get a pass pawn on the queen side where he does have that queen side pawn majority. Now here, Magnus, rook f g4, piling up pressure on that very weak g2 pawn. Now we have rook to f2. Here, Gukesh, instead of defending, he does counterattack on that weak pawn on f7. Now we have rook h7, defending f7 with the rook. Now we have rook takes, and suddenly we do have a king and pawn endgame with 4 pawns apiece. Again, the game is roughly level, but Magnus being the greatest endgame player of all time, again, he is the favorite one here. All right, Gukesh finds the strongest move, a4. Gaining space on the queen side, threatening a takes b5, and trying to get a pass pawn as soon as possible. All right, now here, Magnus, f5, getting his own pawns rolling down the board. Now we have a takes, and here, very importantly, Gukesh, he has to find the move c4. That is the best way to get a pass pawn as soon as possible. But instead, in the game, he goes rook to a2, sliding his rook over, and this is just too slow. Again, c4 was necessary, and now, as you can see by the eval bar collapsing on the left, this is just no good for white. All right, Magnus, rook g5 is the move. Now we have rook to a7, hitting the king. Instead, rook a5, threatening that pawn on b5 was the way forward. Now the king does move, king to f6, rook a2, retreating back and defending the pawn on g2. Here, Gukesh, he's getting more and more passive. Again, missing the idea of c4 is really hurting him in this game. All right, now f4 is the move, marching down the board with the pawn. Now we have rook c2, potentially threatening c4 ideas. Now rook g3, king a2, king e5, and king b2. Again, Magnus running away with this endgame as black. All right, now king d5, rook d2 hits the king to e4, king b3, and e5. Magnus slowly but surely marching his pawns down the board and making progress. Meanwhile, Gukesh is just stalemated on the queen side, not making any real progress. All right, rook e2 hits the king to f5, rook d2, sliding the rook back over, and now e4. Now again, Magnus rolling these pawns down the board in the center of the board. All right, rook d5 hits the king f6, rook takes b5. Finally, Gukesh winning a pawn, but of course, that pawn on g2 is falling, and beyond that, of course, Magnus can just push that e-pawn down the board, and that is what he does, as the rook is going to have a very hard time defending. For example, e3 played in the game, and now the king controls e5. That means the rook is going to have a very hard time getting back to the back rank and defending. Now, rook b6 hits the king to f5, rook b5, king e4. Now, rook b8, intending potentially rook e8. But here, the last move of the game, e2, and here, Gukesh resigns on the spot to Magnus. There is just no way of stopping that pawn. For example, if rook to e8, then the move is king d3, rook d8, king e3, rook e8, and then king to f2. And again, there is nothing stopping e8. Once you give up the rook for the pawn, then the rook can't defend over on the queen side. It is going to be game over sooner or later. For that reason here, Gukesh, in this position, he simply resigned on the spot to the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Magnus and Gukesh D at the 2023 Fide World Cup. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button. And check out this video right here, where Gukesh absolutely obliterates Magnus Carlsen. If you want to see Gukesh get the better of Magnus, check this video out. It is a shocker, and I'll see you in the next video.